Sarah stood before the full-length mirror in her childhood bedroom, her hands trembling as she smoothed down the ivory silk of her wedding dress. The gown had been custom-made, each stitch carefully placed to accommodate her curves, her body, her reality. She had fought so hard to love herself, to silence the voices that told her she wasn't enough, that she didn't deserve this day. But now, with less than 2 hours until the ceremony, those voices were screaming louder than ever. Her mother appeared in the doorway, eyes already glistening with tears. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, pressing her fingers to her lips. Sarah couldn't tell if those were tears of joy or something else entirely. The distinction mattered more than it should have. "Do I look okay?" Sarah asked, hating the vulnerability in her own voice. She had promised herself she wouldn't ask that question today. She had promised herself she would own this moment, own her happiness, own her right to be a bride without qualification or apology. Her mother crossed the room and took Sarah's hands. "You look beautiful. David is the luckiest man alive." But even as she said the words, Sarah caught her mother glancing at her figure, that familiar flicker of concern crossing her face. It was the same look she'd been seeing her whole life, the look that said, "I love you, but I worry about you, but maybe if you just tried a little harder." Sarah's phone buzzed on the dresser. A text from David: "Can't wait to see you. Can't wait to marry you. Can't wait for forever with you." She felt her chest tighten with emotion. David had never made her feel like she needed to be anyone other than who she was. He had pursued her with genuine devotion, had proposed in front of his entire family, had defended her fiercely when his aunt made a cutting remark about wedding dress sizes. He loved her without conditions, without reservations, without the nagging sense that she was a project to be improved. Her bridesmaids began arriving, their chatter filling the room with nervous energy. They helped with her makeup, her hair, the delicate veil that had belonged to her grandmother. Each of them told her she looked stunning, their voices bright and encouraging. But Sarah had spent 32 years learning to detect pity disguised as praise, and she couldn't quite silence the doubt gnawing at her confidence. The photographer arrived, a cheerful woman named Michelle who positioned Sarah by the window for natural light. "Gorgeous," Michelle kept saying as she snapped away. "Absolutely gorgeous. The camera loves you." Sarah tried to believe her, tried to see herself through David's eyes instead of through the lens of every cruel comment she'd ever received. Her father knocked softly before entering, and when he saw her, his face crumpled with emotion. "My baby girl," he said, his voice breaking. He crossed to her and took her in his arms, and for a moment, Sarah felt safe. Her father had always been her protector, her champion, the one who told her she was perfect exactly as she was. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, pulling back to look at her face. "I am," Sarah said, and she meant it. She loved David with everything she had. He was kind and funny and brilliant, and he made her feel like the most important person in the world. She wanted to marry him more than she'd ever wanted anything. "Then let's go get you married," her father said, offering his arm. The drive to the venue was a blur. The church was beautiful, decorated with white roses and soft candlelight, exactly as she and David had planned. As Sarah waited in the vestibule, listening to the string quartet playing inside, she could hear the murmur of guests taking their seats. She wondered what they were thinking, what they were saying to each other in hushed tones. She wondered if they questioned why someone like David was marrying someone like her. She hated herself for wondering, but the thoughts came anyway, uninvited and cruel. The wedding coordinator signaled that it was time. The bridesmaids began their processional. Sarah took a deep breath, gripping her father's arm tighter. This was it. This was her moment. She would not let fear or shame or the judgment of others steal her joy. She deserved this. She deserved love. She deserved happiness. The doors opened, and the music swelled. The moment Sarah stepped into view, she felt the weight of every eye in the sanctuary land on her like a physical force. The traditional wedding march filled the space, but beneath it, she could hear something else, the subtle shift of bodies turning, the intake of breath, the whispers that people thought were quiet but carried in the acoustics of the old church. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, searching for David at the altar. He stood there in his charcoal suit, hands clasped in front of him, and when their eyes met, his face broke into the most radiant smile she'd ever seen. That smile was everything. That smile was why she kept walking, why she held her head high, why she refused to let the whispers touch her. But they were there nonetheless. As she passed the third row, she heard a woman's voice, barely concealed behind a raised hand. "I mean, I'm happy for David, but really? Huh?" The words sliced through Sarah's composure like a blade. Her step faltered for just a fraction of a second, but her father's arm tightened around hers, steadying her, urging her forward. In the fifth row, a teenage girl stared openly, her mouth slightly agape, before her mother elbowed her and hissed a reprimand. Sarah caught the girl's expression before she looked away, not quite disgust, but something close to bewilderment, as if she couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. An elderly man near the center aisle leaned toward his wife and said, in a voice he clearly thought was a whisper, "That's quite a dress. Must have taken a lot of fabric." His wife shushed him sharply, but the damage was done. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, felt her carefully applied makeup suddenly seem like war paint, like she was trying too hard to make herself into something she could never be. David's cousin Bethany sat near the front, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. She had made no secret of her feelings about this marriage, had cornered Sarah at the rehearsal dinner to suggest that maybe she should consider David's future, his career, his image. "People judge," Bethany had said with false concern. "You know how society is. I just want what's best for him." Sarah had walked away before she said something she'd regret, but now, passing Bethany's judgmental stare, she felt that conversation echo in her mind. The aisle seemed endless. Each step felt like a test she was failing. Sarah's bouquet trembled in her hands, white roses and baby's breath that suddenly felt absurdly delicate against her body. She had chosen them because they were classic, traditional, the kind of bouquet every bride carried. But now they seemed like a costume piece, like she was playing dress-up in someone else's fantasy. A flash of movement caught her eye. A woman in a purple dress was holding up her phone, clearly recording the processional. Sarah saw herself on the screen as the woman adjusted her angle, saw her body, her dress, her face, and wondered what caption would accompany that video when it was inevitably posted online. She had made her social media accounts private months ago, after a stranger had sent her a message saying she was brave for not letting her weight stop her from pursuing love. The backhanded cruelty of it had haunted her for weeks. Her father sensed her distress. He leaned close and whispered, "Eyes on David. Just David. Nobody else matters." She tried to follow his advice, tried to block out the rows of faces, the expressions that ranged from curious to critical to outright shocked. She tried to remember why she was here, what this day was supposed to mean. But then she heard it, a child's voice, high and clear and completely without guile, "Mama, why is the bride so fat?" The question rang out in a moment of unfortunate quiet, when the music had dipped to a softer passage. Sarah's steps stopped completely. She couldn't help it. The innocence of the question somehow made it worse than all the adult whispers combined. Children didn't lie. Children said what everyone else was thinking. A horrified shushing sound followed, and Sarah couldn't bring herself to look toward the source. Her vision blurred with tears she absolutely could not shed, not here, not now, not with everyone watching. Her father's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "Keep walking, sweetheart," he murmured. "You're almost there." She forced her feet to move again. One step. Another. The altar was getting closer. David was still smiling at her, but now she could see concern creeping into his expression. He could tell something was wrong. He always could. That was one of the things she loved about him, his ability to read her emotions, his attentiveness to her pain. 3 rows from the front, she passed David's grandmother, who dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Sarah couldn't tell if those were tears of joy or tears of disappointment in her grandson's choice. The old woman had always been kind to Sarah's face, but there was something in her careful politeness that suggested dutiful acceptance rather than genuine warmth. Finally, mercifully, Sarah reached the front of the church. Her father lifted her veil and kissed her cheek, his own eyes wet with emotion. "I love you," he whispered. "You are beautiful, and you deserve every happiness." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and turned toward David. He took her hands in his, and the moment their skin touched, she felt some of the tension drain from her body. His grip was warm and steady and real. He leaned close and whispered, "You take my breath away." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let his love be enough to drown out everything else. The officiant began to speak, but Sarah was barely listening. She was too aware of the congregation behind her, too conscious of being watched and evaluated and found wanting. Her wedding day, the day she had dreamed about since childhood, had become an endurance test. Reverend Mitchell opened his leather-bound Bible and began the traditional words of the marriage ceremony, his voice resonating through the sanctuary with practiced authority. Sarah tried to focus on the familiar phrases, on the sacred nature of what was happening, but her mind kept drifting to the sea of faces behind her. She could feel their attention like heat on her back, could sense the continued whispers despite the solemnity of the moment. David squeezed her hands gently, trying to pull her back to him, back to what mattered. She looked into his warm brown eyes and saw nothing but love and certainty. He had never wavered, not once in their 3 years together. When they met at a mutual friend's party, he had approached her with genuine interest, had asked about her work as a pediatric nurse, had laughed at her jokes without condescension. Their first date had lasted 6 hours because neither of them wanted it to end. He had told her she was beautiful on that first night, and every day since. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, Reverend Mitchell intoned, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God. Sarah felt the irony of those words. Nothing about her path to this altar had been light. Every step had been heavy with the weight of other people's opinions, other people's expectations, other people's narrow definitions of what a bride should look like. A baby began crying somewhere in the middle rows, and Sarah heard the mother's hurried footsteps as she carried the child toward the exit. In the brief disturbance, more whispers rose and fell. Sarah caught fragments, never would have guessed David would. And, suppose love is blind. And, wonder how long it'll last. David must have heard them too, because his jaw tightened and his eyes flickered with anger. But when he looked back at Sarah, his expression softened immediately. He mouthed, "I love you," and she felt tears threatening again. Reverend Mitchell moved into the section about the covenant of marriage, speaking about sacrifice and commitment and choosing to love despite imperfection. Sarah wondered if people were applying those words specifically to her situation, if they were thinking that David was the one making the sacrifice, that loving her required some extraordinary act of grace or charity. The thought made her stomach turn. The ceremony continued with a reading from Corinthians about love being patient and kind. David's sister Emily delivered the passage beautifully, her voice clear and emotional. Emily had been wonderful throughout the wedding planning, had treated Sarah like the sister she'd always wanted, had shut down her mother's passive-aggressive comments about dress styles and photography angles. Sarah was grateful for Emily's authentic kindness, but she knew Emily couldn't control what everyone else thought. When it came time for the vows, David went first. He had written his own, and as he began to speak, his voice thick with emotion, Sarah felt the weight on her chest begin to lift slightly. "Sarah," he said, "from the moment I met you, I knew my life would never be the same. You are the kindest, funniest, most compassionate person I've ever known. You make me want to be better. You make me believe in the goodness of the world. You are beautiful in every possible way, and I am humbled that you chose me. I promise to spend every day of our lives making sure you know how extraordinary you are." Sarah's tears spilled over then, and she didn't care who saw. These were the words she needed, the truth she had to hold on to. But even as David spoke, she heard a woman somewhere behind them say to her companion, "Well, he's certainly putting on a good show." The comment was like poison dropped into pure water, contaminating the moment. Her own vows felt hollow in her mouth when it was her turn to speak them, though she had spent weeks perfecting every word. She told David he was her safe place, her best friend, her greatest adventure. She promised to support his dreams and celebrate his victories and hold him through his failures. She meant every word, but she couldn't shake the feeling that people were listening with skepticism, waiting for the facade to crack, waiting for David to realize his mistake. When Reverend Mitchell asked if anyone present knew any reason why these two should not be married, Sarah's heart stopped. The traditional pause felt like an eternity. She half expected someone to stand up, to voice the objections she imagined they all harbored. But silence held, and the ceremony continued. The exchange of rings came next. David's hands were steady as he slid the platinum band onto her finger, but Sarah's trembled as she tried to do the same for him. She fumbled slightly, and a nervous laugh rippled through some of the guests. Her face burned with humiliation. She couldn't even get this simple part right. But David caught her hand and steadied it, guiding the ring into place with such gentleness that her heart ached. "Perfect," he whispered, though only she could hear. Reverend Mitchell raised his hands and pronounced them husband and wife, and before he even finished saying "You may kiss the bride," David had pulled Sarah close and pressed his lips to hers. It was a real kiss, not the chaste peck many couples offered to the audience, and Sarah heard several gasps of surprise. She didn't care. For those few seconds, she let herself get lost in David, in the reality that this man was now her husband, that he had chosen her and would keep choosing her. When they broke apart, David was grinning, and despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling back. They turned to face the congregation as Reverend Mitchell announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. David Chen." The applause that followed felt perfunctory, obligatory, but it was applause nonetheless. They began walking back down the aisle together, and Sarah tried to let David's steady presence beside her shield her from the stares. But she saw the expressions anyway, the forced smiles, the obvious surprise, the barely concealed judgment. An older woman in the back row actually shook her head slowly, as if witnessing a tragedy. Halfway down the aisle, Sarah's heel caught on the hem of her dress. She stumbled, and David's arm immediately wrapped around her waist, catching her before she could fall. "I've got you," he said firmly. But she heard the snickers, saw the phones come up to capture the moment. Tomorrow, she thought bitterly, someone would probably make a meme about the fat bride who couldn't even walk down the aisle without nearly falling. The reception hall had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale. String lights crisscrossed the ceiling like stars, and centerpieces of cream roses and eucalyptus adorned every table. Sarah had spent months planning every detail, determined that if people were going to judge her, they would at least have to admit her wedding was beautiful. But as guests filed in and took their seats, she noticed the way some of them looked around with barely concealed surprise, as if they hadn't expected her to have good taste. The traditional grand entrance came first. The DJ announced the wedding party one couple at a time, and each pair received enthusiastic applause as they entered the hall. But when he announced for the first time as husband and wife, David and Sarah Chen, the applause that greeted them felt different, more muted, more cautious. David either didn't notice or didn't care. He raised their joined hands triumphantly and led her to the dance floor for their first dance. They had chosen a classic song, "The Way You Look Tonight," and as the opening notes played, David pulled Sarah close. "Just you and me," he whispered against her ear. "Forget everyone else." She tried, she really did. As they swayed together, she let herself sink into his arms, let herself remember why she loved him, why this day mattered despite the cruelty it had contained. But then the song ended, and tradition dictated that others joined them on the dance floor. Sarah's father came to claim a dance, and over his shoulder, she could see the guests watching them. Some were smiling genuinely, moved by the father-daughter moment. But others looked uncomfortable, whispered behind hands, sipped their champagne with knowing looks. David danced with his mother next, a petite woman who barely came up to his shoulder. Sarah saw them talking intently, saw the concern on Mrs. Chen's face, saw David's expression harden with frustration. When the dance ended, Mrs. Chen approached Sarah with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to the family, dear," she said, kissing Sarah's cheek with lips that barely made contact. Dinner service began, and Sarah found herself at the head table between David and Emily, picking at her food while trying to appear relaxed and happy. She was acutely aware of every bite she took, conscious that people might be watching, might be judging her food choices, might be making assumptions about her body and her habits. She ended up eating almost nothing, her appetite destroyed by anxiety. The toasts began. Emily went first, telling charming stories about David's childhood and welcoming Sarah warmly. David's best man followed with jokes about David's terrible cooking and his tendency to talk about Sarah constantly. "This man is completely smitten," he said, raising his glass. "And anyone who spends 5 minutes with them can see why. Sarah makes him happier than I've ever seen him." But then David's cousin Marcus took the microphone, and Sarah's stomach dropped. Marcus had been drinking steadily since the ceremony, and his face was flushed as he swayed slightly at the front of the room. "I've known David my whole life," Marcus began, his words slightly slurred. "And I gotta say, I never imagined he'd end up with someone so." He paused, and the room went silent with tension. Different from what we all expected. David was on his feet immediately. "That's enough, Marcus," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. But Marcus continued, oblivious or uncaring. "I mean, my boy David could have had anyone, right? Good-looking guy, successful career, great family. But he chose to go in a different direction, and we gotta respect that, even if we don't understand it." He raised his glass in a mock toast. "To being open-minded." Several people gasped. David strode toward Marcus and physically removed the microphone from his hand. "Get out," David said. "You're drunk, you're being disrespectful to my wife, and you need to leave. Now." Marcus's face went from flushed to red. "I was just being honest, man. Everyone's thinking it." He gestured broadly at the room. "Look around. Nobody here believes this is real. They're all just too polite to say it." Security appeared then. David's brothers had been watching the situation unfold, and they escorted Marcus out amid his protests. The room erupted in uncomfortable chatter, everyone trying to talk over what had just happened, trying to pretend they hadn't heard what they'd heard. Sarah felt like she couldn't breathe. The walls of the reception hall seemed to be closing in. She stood abruptly, and Emily immediately stood with her. "Bathroom," Sarah managed to say, and Emily nodded, following her as she fled the head table. In the ladies' room, Sarah braced herself against the marble counter, staring at her reflection. Her makeup was still perfect, her hair still elegantly styled, but all she could see was what Marcus had seen, what everyone saw, someone who didn't belong, someone who had somehow tricked David into marrying her. Emily stood behind her, visible in the mirror. "Don't let him ruin this," Emily said firmly. "Marcus is a drunk idiot who's been jealous of David their entire lives. His opinion means nothing." "But he said what everyone's thinking," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "You heard him. Everyone's thinking it." "He's right, Emily. I've seen the looks, heard the whispers. Your family doesn't think I'm good enough for David. Nobody does." "That's not true," Emily insisted. "My parents adore you. My grandparents were just telling me how lovely you are. David's friends all think you're perfect for him. And even if some people are small-minded and cruel, so what? You married David, not them." Before Sarah could respond, the bathroom door opened, and a woman in a crimson dress entered. Sarah recognized her as one of David's colleagues, someone she'd met briefly at a work event months ago. The woman's eyes widened when she saw Sarah, and she froze awkwardly. "The bride's bathroom," she said with false cheer. "I should have known I'd find you here. Congratulations." But her eyes flicked to Emily and back, and Sarah knew she'd probably been hoping to gossip about what had just happened with whoever she found in here. Sarah splashed cold water on her face, careful not to ruin her makeup beyond repair, and straightened her shoulders. "I should get back," she said to Emily. When they returned to the reception, David was waiting just outside the door. The moment he saw Sarah, relief flooded his face. He pulled her into a tight embrace, not caring who was watching. "I'm so sorry," he said into her hair. "I should have seen that coming, should have cut Marcus off earlier." "It's not your fault," Sarah said, though part of her wondered if he blamed himself for choosing her, if he was beginning to regret the complications she brought to his life. "Let's cut the cake," David suggested. "Give everyone something else to focus on." The elaborate three-tier wedding cake stood on a dedicated table near the dance floor, adorned with cascading sugar flowers that had cost more than Sarah wanted to admit. The DJ announced the cake-cutting ceremony, and guests began gathering around with their phones raised, ready to capture the moment. Sarah felt the familiar dread settling over her as she and David approached the cake together, knowing that this tradition was about to become another opportunity for judgment and mockery. David picked up the silver cake knife, his hand steady despite the tension that had defined the evening. He placed his hand over Sarah's, and together they sliced into the bottom tier. The photographer circled them, camera clicking rapidly, catching every angle. Sarah tried to smile naturally, tried to project joy and romance, but her face felt frozen in a mask of performance. The custom was to feed each other a small bite of cake, and Sarah braced herself for what she knew was coming. Some people did it sweetly, a gentle offering on a fork. Others smashed the cake into their partner's face for laughs. She and David had agreed to keep it dignified, but she saw the anticipation in some of the guests' faces, the hope for spectacle and embarrassment. David lifted a small piece of cake on a fork and brought it to her lips with exaggerated gentleness, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her heart flutter despite everything. She took the bite, and he smiled like she'd given him a gift. When it was her turn, she offered him cake with slightly trembling hands, and he ate it with such obvious delight that a few people actually ate. But then she heard it, a man's voice from somewhere in the crowd, not even bothering to whisper, surprised she didn't eat the whole cake herself. Laughter followed, not widespread but enough to be unmistakable. Sarah's hand dropped to her side, the fork clattering against the plate. Her vision blurred with tears she'd been holding back all day. David's head snapped toward the source of the comment, his expression thunderous. "Who said that?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "I want to know who just said that." The room went silent, guests exchanging uncomfortable glances. Nobody moved. Nobody confessed. "This ends now," David said, and Sarah had never heard him sound so fierce, so absolutely done with civility. He took her hand and led her to the microphone that still stood near the head table from the toasts. "Everyone, I need your attention," he said, and the authority in his voice commanded immediate silence. Sarah tried to pull back, mortified at the idea of being made into more of a spectacle, but David held her hand firmly. "I have something to say, and you're all going to listen," he announced. "I married Sarah today because I love her," David began, his voice ringing clear across the reception hall. "I married her because she is the most incredible person I have ever known. I married her because she makes me laugh, because she challenges me to be better, because she sees the world with kindness and compassion that most people can't even imagine. I married her because when I picture my future, I can't picture it without her." He turned to face Sarah fully, still speaking into the microphone so everyone could hear. Sarah, you are beautiful. You are brilliant. You are worthy of every good thing in this world. And if anyone here can't see that, if anyone here has spent this day judging you, mocking you, questioning why I chose you, then they don't deserve to be part of our celebration. Sarah was openly crying now, tears streaming down her face, but for the first time all day, they weren't tears of shame. David's voice cracked with emotion as he continued. I've heard the whispers. I've seen the looks. I heard that comment just now, and I'm disgusted. You should all be ashamed of yourselves. This woman right here, my wife, spends her days caring for sick children. She has a master's degree. She volunteers at a homeless shelter. She is brilliant and kind and funny, and yes, she is beautiful, inside and out. The only question anyone should have is why she lowered her standards enough to marry me. A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd, but most people looked deeply uncomfortable, caught in their cruelty and unable to deny it. Sarah saw David's cousin Bethany staring at her lap, her face red. She saw several people wipe away tears, whether from shame or genuine emotion, she couldn't tell. If you came here today with judgment in your hearts, David said, his voice softening but losing none of its power, then I hope you leave having learned something about yourselves. Because the problem isn't Sarah. The problem isn't her body or her appearance or whether she meets your narrow, shallow standards of what a bride should look like. The problem is you. The problem is a society that teaches people to value appearances over character, that measures worth in pounds and inches instead of kindness and courage. He paused, seeming to gather himself. Sarah squeezed his hand, both grateful and overwhelmed. She had never felt so seen, so defended, so valued. David looked out at the crowd, making eye contact with several people who quickly looked away. Sarah has dealt with this kind of cruelty her entire life, he said quietly. She has been mocked and dismissed and underestimated by people who took one look at her and decided they knew everything about her. And yet she is still kind. She still believes in the goodness of people. She still gives everyone the benefit of the doubt. That right there, is real beauty. That is real strength. The room was absolutely silent now. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, frozen in place by the intensity of the moment. Sarah felt exposed and vulnerable and strangely powerful all at once. This was her life, laid bare in front of 100 people. This was her pain, acknowledged and validated by the man she loved. This was her worth, proclaimed not by her but by someone who truly saw her. Then, cutting through the heavy silence, came a small voice from somewhere near the back of the room. Papa, why are people being mean to the pretty lady? Heads turned to locate the source. Sarah saw a little girl, perhaps 5 years old, standing on her chair with her hand held by a man who was clearly her father. The child had dark curls and wore a pink dress, and she was pointing directly at Sarah with the unself-conscious clarity that only children possess. Sit down, sweetie, the father whispered urgently, clearly mortified. But the little girl refused. No, Papa. Why are they being mean? She's so beautiful. She looks like a princess in the movies. She has a pretty dress and pretty flowers and pretty hair. Why don't they see it? The father tried again to quiet her, but the girl's voice rose with indignant confusion. She's beautiful, Papa. Tell them she's beautiful. Sarah felt something break open in her chest. Not break as in shatter, but break as in bloom, as in a long frozen river cracking into spring. This child, this honest, innocent child, saw her with eyes uncorrupted by society's prejudices. This child looked at her and saw a princess, saw beauty without qualification, saw worth without condition. The little girl's father finally gave up trying to silence her. He lifted her into his arms and carried her closer to where Sarah and David stood. I'm so sorry, he said, embarrassed. My daughter, she has a very strong sense of justice. She's been upset all evening because she could tell people were being unkind. Don't apologize, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. She knelt down so she was eye level with the child. What's your name, sweetheart? Lily, the girl said. Are you really a princess? Today I am, Sarah said, smiling through her tears. Lily reached out and touched Sarah's veil gently, reverently, as if it were made of magic. You're the most beautiful bride I ever saw. My papa says people should be nice always, especially on happy days. Are you happy? Sarah looked up at David, who was watching the interaction with tears streaming down his own face now. She looked back at this perfect, pure-hearted child who had somehow managed to say what needed to be said in the simplest possible terms. Yes, Sarah said. Yes, I'm very happy. Good, Lily said firmly. She turned to survey the crowd with the confidence of a child who knows she's right. Everyone should tell her she's beautiful, she announced. It's not nice to make the bride cry sad tears. Say she's beautiful. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Emily stood up at the head table and began to applaud. You're beautiful, Sarah, she said clearly. David's father joined in, then his mother, then slowly, inevitably, the rest of the room. The applause grew, and people began calling out their agreement, some with genuine feeling, others perhaps motivated by shame, but all of them acknowledging what should have been obvious from the beginning. Lily's father was wiping his own eyes now. My daughter, he said to Sarah and David, she was born with a congenital heart condition. We spent 2 years in and out of hospitals, and the doctors kept telling us not to get our hopes up. But she fought, and she survived, and she taught me that real beauty, real worth, has nothing to do with meeting other people's expectations. David reached out and shook the man's hand. Thank you, he said. Thank you for raising someone who sees clearly. Sarah stood and embraced Lily gently, carefully, gratefully. Thank you for reminding everyone what matters, she whispered into the child's ear. Lily pulled back and patted Sarah's cheek with one small hand. You're welcome, Princess Bride. Now you should dance more. Princesses always dance at the end. And so they did. David led Sarah back to the dance floor, and this time when the music started, it felt different. The weight of the day began to lift. Other couples joined them, the dance floor filling with movement and music and something that felt almost like joy. Not everyone, Sarah noticed. Some people slipped out early, unable to face what they'd been forced to confront about themselves. But others approached her throughout the rest of the evening to apologize, to congratulate, to tell her she looked beautiful with what seemed like genuine sincerity. As midnight approached and the reception began to wind down, Sarah found herself back at the head table with David, both of them exhausted but somehow lighter than they'd been hours before. That was quite a day, David said, understating it dramatically. That little girl, Sarah said, watching Lily dance with her father across the room. She saved me today. She saved both of us. No, David said, turning her face toward his. You saved yourself. You showed up. You walked down that aisle. You stood there and took the hits and kept going. That little girl just said what I've been trying to tell you all along. What I'll keep telling you every day for the rest of our lives. Sarah kissed him then, not caring who saw or what they thought. They had survived their wedding day. They had faced cruelty and emerged with their love intact, maybe even stronger for having been tested. Tomorrow they would leave for their honeymoon, would begin building their life together, would face new challenges and probably new judgments. But tonight, on